Transformation arrives today in Cities Skylines 2 with this major update just dropping to fight some of the fires in and around the game. In this video we'll talk about the 4 key changes, including 2 brand spanking new maps, some vital gameplay updates and necessary fixes in there, as well as performance and graphical improvements. As per usual, there'll be time cards and everything else you might need linked below. Without any further mucking about, let's jump in, and we're going to start with the 2 brand new maps. As you can see, 14 maps now total in a new game of Cities Skylines 2. The first of which, Corral Riches, is, generally speaking, a pretty flat map with reasonable access but not overwhelming access to most resources, plenty of buildable area at 76%, and generally a fairly warm climate. Now, as we discussed earlier this week, the design inspiration for the 2 new maps was revealed. The one that we just looked at, flatland. Hills, slopes, mountains, no thank you. I'd rather stay leveled, no need for contour lines. The second one is inspired by the idea of the land of the eternal sun, and that is made very clear when you first spawn in, and of course with the name of the map, Sunshine Peninsula. Here you can see temperatures rarely drop below 11 degrees Celsius, and while it may have a little bit less access to buildable area, resources are still reasonably plentiful. Of course, the design here is that there should be no rain and steady warm temperatures. Ideal if, instead of avoiding the contouring issues with flatland, you'd like to avoid any nasty seasonality that may or may not occur in Cities Skylines 2. And that, my friends, are the 2 new maps, the winter treat, as they call it, Sunshine Peninsula and Corral Riches. Now let's move through and talk about the actual gameplay update itself, and we're going to start with some very important gameplay fixes. 5 sort of semi-categories emerge. The first one, very important, it's traffic. Obviously traffic in Cities Skylines 2 has several issues, one of them being how frantic and wildly people change lanes. 2 fixes or improvements have come. The first one is that they claim to have improved lane-changing behavior for vehicles. And secondly, traffic accidents will no longer last forever. Those traffic accidents that never seem to be solved have been fixed. I think the operative word with lane-changing behavior is improved. They don't claim to have fixed it, they don't claim this to be a silver bullet, but they do claim that some improvements have been made. In my personal experience, I'm still seeing some issues with traffic deciding to change lane at very odd times in very odd places. A brief interjection to say Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and all I want for Christmas is for you to subscribe. Now, ground-based traffic aren't the only peoples to receive some updates. Also, air transport and the sea received a little bit of loving. In terms of cargo transport by air, the largest upgrades came in terms of increased capacity. Airplane cargo capacity doubled to 100 tons, and the airport cargo terminal capacity a whopping increase, up from 100 tons to 720. They've also added all resource types to airplane outside connections, which is nice, and they've stopped cargo terminals from storing garbage as a resource. Nice to see. And this one also transitions nicely into the storage fixes and improvements as well, which are frankly a little bit of an awkward read, but as always, they'll be on screen and linked down below for your viewing pleasure. The main improvement comes to the fact that storage buildings will now consider current storage and future storage, so they'll now finally take into account cargo that is already on its way. The remainder of things here under the storage category are all fixes. Perhaps notably, they've made it so that now exports won't happen when the output resource amount is below 0. They've also fixed the fact that resources might have become negative when transport vehicles loaded a large amount of that resource, negative amounts reset to 0 in existing saves, or the fact that airports can import goods from road outside connections when there's no cargo route available. So a series of fixes for storage, frankly, not the sexiest part of the update, but we have 1 or 2 more things to cover in gameplay fixes, and then we'll talk about performance and graphics. Starting firstly though with the economy fixes and improvements to it, and this was something that we talked about earlier in the week when they put out their developer diary, their weekly update, if you will. And frankly, I feel like it's slightly light on the ground here in comparison to what I was expecting it to be, at least. The main improvement is the fact that they have, however, replaced the money buffering system with a brand new one. What does that actually mean for gameplay? Well, it means that your city's income should be more predictable now, less prone perhaps to wild swings and things that just don't make a great deal of sense. They've also fixed the fact that income was being awarded twice and the unknown profit issue during storage transfers. Again, fairly light on the ground, but that first change, that new money buffering system, could help to overhaul the economy. Hopefully, it will also help us understand our city's services better, which ones we need and how much they cost. I remember that being mentioned in the weekly update. We'll have to see how that plays out here. And finally, some miscellaneous gameplay changes, often overlooked like the middle child, but we shouldn't do that here. Firstly, some fixes, largely you might say around pedestrians. Pedestrians now won't have navigation issues with the train station's underground subway upgrade, though it does require that building to be rebuilt for this change to take effect. Pedestrians should also not be walking through the air between elevated, lowered raised tunnel networks and buildings. They've also fixed some issues around options in the search text and pathfinding for resources that don't include cargo loading locations. The second part of these miscellaneous fixes, largely quality of life improvements and adjusting the belt a little bit. Saving and rebooting the game, which used to give you extra XP based on the number of residential buildings in the city, no longer happens, as well as a couple of achievements that couldn't be earned can be 4 seasons in spiderwebbing, and some photo mode improvements. If you, like me, enjoy using the photo mode, pressing M while in the photo mode now removes UI permanently for the rest of the session, and they added some missing localization for photo mode. And there we have the gameplay improvements. Now let's talk performance and graphics. Performance, perhaps the most juicy and anticipated part of this update, so let's crack into that. The first change is that they've added LODs for characters and selected assets. I'm no game developer, I'm no expert on this kind of thing, but put simply, LOD, or level of detail, refers to how complicated the models in this game are being rendered in real time, and this should help reduce the amount of shapes or textures that are being processed, the detail that's being processed, the further away these objects get from you. Ultimately, what's the outcome? Well, it should be that the game is working less, it's not working as hard, it's not processing as much, and therefore it can run more smoothly. And I'll talk about my experience, my 2 cents worth, as I like to do in these update videos, at the end, once we've got the facts out of the way. Speaking of which, there are 4 more points under the improvements to performance category. They've optimized the geometry layout for all assets in the game. They've also decreased virtual texturing pressure with assets that don't use emissive maps. That mightn't mean so much to you, but the final 2 will. They've disabled VSync from default settings, and also some of those lighting calculations, volumetric lighting calculations to be specific, where the impacts or the effects were mostly invisible to you and I. The net outcome from this should be improved performance by reducing the pressure and stress that Cities Skylines 2, and this, what is honestly, when it works, a wonderful simulation, that pressure that it puts on your system. And before my 2 cents worth, graphics, which we could probably think of more as the car's paint job than the engine. They say that they've added line color to passenger ships, cargo ships, and cargo train engines. I thought that was actually already in the game, but it's not, apparently. Well, now it is. And also a variety of improvements to the quality of character model variations, fixing visual glitches with metallic smoothness, light props on the Grand Bridge. They've improved the lighting, speaking of, on forestry machinery, and the propping for several buildings. Finally, a load of fixes around cargo trucks spawning and crosswalk looks being broken. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of the patch notes. Time quickly now for some reflections. So at the top of the video, we talked about 2 new maps that have been introduced to the game, and my initial instinct is, great, that's awesome. How could we complain about new content? Although, of course, it should be noted that in some ways it's kind of a backdoor workaround for the awkward terrain with the introduction of a flatland map, or maybe some of the awkward seasonality and performance implications that are introduced by it with the other map. So, nice to see, but of course this is ultimately just a Barbie prize, if you will, for the fact that there is still no editor inside of the game. Performance improvements. The first major update that we've seen to performance inside of Cities Skylines 2. Yes, as you rightly pointed out in previous videos, they have touched on performance before. Maybe you've seen an improvement of around 10 frames per second between the game's launch and the time of recording this video. I think that it'll need a bit more testing. To be honest, the game still very much struggles with simulation speed running anything beyond a crawl with large cities, even on my high-end PC. So I do not think that this patch is the silver bullet. I do think, though, it's probably moving in the right direction. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you've measured or even just noticed some performance improvements, particularly earlier on in the simulation. Because as I say, big cities, still a struggle bus. And finally, those gameplay fixes. Hard for me really to critique or offer any other insights onto these other than, are they necessary? Yes. Are they good? Yes. Are some of them perhaps more difficult to quantify than others, like improving lane-changing behavior for vehicles? Absolutely yes. But on balance, I think that this is a positive improvement for Cities Skylines 2. I'd also like to note that technically, for the couple of commenters who will probably bring this up, this wasn't a major quote-unquote update on Steam. Was it the most significant one, the most sort of major one that we've seen so far? Absolutely. New maps, they finally took a deep dive into performance to tackle some of those more complicated issues, and of course the gameplay fixes. Though I just wanted to point that out. Technically, not a major update, but still a hotfix. Now this could be because hotfixes are easier to roll out than major updates, and some of the implications around that, so I won't delve too deep into that and speculate that there might be an even bigger one coming at the start of next year or anything like that. I just wanted to point it out. Thank you so much for joining me, not just on this video, but on all of my Cities videos. Your support has been huge, like overwhelmingly huge. It's great to see so many people, some of them even choosing to stick around and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll have more updates when they update the game next year, and of course, plenty more content in between. I'll see you next time.